Hello and welcome to the Noizze podcast, sponsored by Stereo Brain Records and brought to you as part of the Noizze podcast network. I'm today's host, definitely not your boy, but instead your very tired man, Jack Holloway. I'm joined by Mr. Cynical himself, Samuel Lewis. Feels weird to say. And Noizze's biggest hot take, Elliot Grimmy. Welcome both. Hello, Sam. How are you?
I'm well. I'm looking forward to a podcast where we're definitely going to agree all at once, all the way through for the first
It's a
time in
really,
recorded
it's a really
history.
happy place for us all to be in.
Getting me and Elliot on a podcast where we actually enjoy the same thing simultaneously feels a little bit like when they got Israel and Palestine in the room the first time.
Yeah, context for that. Any other record, almost this doesn't work. So getting you
Mm.
two in the same room for something, this feels like safe territory, but I could be wrong. And I'm, as you can tell, I'm really excited because I'm really bouncy and really like, yay, we're going to talk about Linkin Park on the podcast. Um, and
I
don't
think we
ruin that
have
for me, please.
we have managed to grab the three biggest Linkin Park fans in Noise and just
Yay.
Shove us together and just see what happens. Yeah.
Yeah, give it to me. Elliot, welcome. Not your first rodeo, but
hello.
relatively new here still. How's it going?
Yeah, pretty good, pretty good. I'm about as excited as you guys, to be honest. To get to,
Mm.
we get to talk about something we all actually care about.
I think all of us were simultaneously thinking that, when uh Meteora 20th anniversary edition was announced that we should do something, and then it just all
Mm,
sort of, I think we synced up. I think that's more what happened than anything else.
yeah.
So yeah, if you haven't guessed already, slightly different to what we usually do. We're usually a rock and metal reviews podcast, coming at you sort of every 2 weeks or so with a couple of reviews on current records, but with a really special release that's coming up for Linkin Park on Friday, celebrating 20 years. I mean, sorry, 20 years. Oh, God. I'll get onto it. 20 years of Meteora. They are releasing an anniversary edition of the Grammy Award nominated multi-platinum sophomore album, which feels ridiculous to say. As usual with a re-release of this scale, I don't think anyone quite does it like Linkin Park. Um, as you would expect, they've gone all in. Aside from the artwork, insane kind of packages that you can purchase as a fan, videos, additional content, the band are releasing an impressive track list that includes tracks from Live in Texas, which is one of mine and Sam's favorite shared live moments. And I hope it's the same for you, Elliot, because it's special. It has got Live in Nottingham 2003. It's got tracks from Project Revolution. It's got demos, original versions of tracks, and unreleased songs. And it works out as something like the album plus 76 tracks. It's just like, and it frustrates me that they've had it in the locker, but we'll come on to it. We'll come on to
Mm.
it. As we record this, both Lost and Fighting Myself have been released from the LP archives, with Lost having the biggest debut for a rock song in recent memory in the US, with it being a number one single and scoring their highest charting single in the UK since 2007. It's the biggest rock song in the US of 2023 so far, and yeah, their previously most commercially successful was What I've Done, which would be no surprise to anyone, because Transformers in it. Either of you, when I say that for Lost and hearing that, are you surprised?
No.
No, no, not
Are you just
particularly.
are you also, yeah, like, nor am I, but are you also like, I can't believe this band have had this song just sort of tucked away. I think
I
they
feel
forgot they
like it's interesting because obviously I remember either watching or reading an interview with Mike where he basically disclosed that the reason that this song was never included on the record in the first place was that it was too tonally similar to, I think it was Numb. And we literally, like, in an alternate timeline we could have had Lost having already been out for 20 years and Numb coming out of the vault and doing what Lost has just done effectively. They're both great songs, but yeah, it, like, as you said earlier, it feels kind of criminal that this song has just been locked away in a vault for so long when it is that good. Like, it's crazy.
It's mental, isn't it? It doesn't surprise me at all. Sam, did that surprise you?
No, I think it more confirms a few things if you look at this wider. I think Linkin Park's role really outside of Foo Fighters are probably the biggest selling American rock band of the last 20 years by with a bullet really. Seven-time platinum Meteora was in 2003. And anything it speaks to a particular timestamp. And I wanted to talk about this a little bit more in detail a little bit later, so I'll hold on a lot of stuff like that. But it's this particular album is so specifically tailored to this to the era that existed in music at the time, really the tail end of the nu metal era. And Linkin Park was fast forwarding towards this more electronic style that they adopted later on and all that type of stuff. But I think it speaks to the power of that period of time in people's minds that a song that is, as Elliot points out, is reminiscent of Numb tonally. Still feels strong on its own, but it is the pull of that period of time is still so strong that people are flocking back to it. Meteora's having a moment. And it's representative of the cocktail of things, obviously Chester's death and the nostalgia of that. That will always be an element of it that's pushed this to the fore. But you actually think about the fact that really Meteora is one of the 3 to 4 most successful rock albums of the 21st century, and one of the 3 to 4 really last albums of the 21st century from that genre that I would argue was culturally impactful with the crossover that happened with Jay-Z later and nu metal being an actual part of modern popular culture. That was probably the last timestamp where metal bands are actually socially relevant outside of the alternative genre. And I think this being released 20 years later, without an ability to tour it, without Chester even being alive, they're immediately on Howard Stern. It just speaks to how powerful that period of time was. Like, I don't know how well you guys remember that period of time, but I have vivid memories of like bands like Korn and Limp Bizkit and Linkin Park being part of the modern cultural zeitgeist. They were on talk shows, they were on Top of the Pops, they were on radio interviews, not like tucked away in our little corners of Twitter and Reddit like we have metal bands now, but they were genuinely part of modern society. And this is almost nice for me, obviously. Now I'm 30, I'm having a big life crisis, obviously, experiencing this music. But it's reminiscent of a period of time where rock was a real part of culture, and people gravitating to Lost, even though it's so close to the stuff that's already out there, is evidence that there's large swathes of culture that are still craving for bands like that and rock music to still be a part of our modern day to day in a larger sense, I think.
You're bang on, man. Absolutely bang on. I'm going to rewind a little bit and set the scene, because what we're going to do today is we're going to talk less about the 20th anniversary edition, and we're going to consider Meteor at the time, its impact, its influence, how it kind of, where it sits, and particularly after the debut. I mean, Linkin Park emerged as one of the best-selling artists of the last 20 years. Sam, you touched upon that. That's largely thanks to their diamond-certified debut, Hybrid Theory, which stands as, I think, the best-selling debut of the 21st century, full stop, which is absurd. It's got US sales in excess of 11 million and worldwide sales of over 55 million. Now, put yourself in the band's position at that point, and they've got to follow that up. and I can't imagine how that must have felt for the band. And I remember they've given interviews in the past where they said that it wasn't almost the commercial success pressure that was getting to them, because they were kind of aware at that point that they'd struck something that just hit, and replicating that was going to get them nowhere. But that they wanted to artistically move things in the right direction and take what they'd done on Hybrid Theory and put it into Meteora and kind of make it bigger and bolder. Critical reception wise, it had that sort of general reception. It was, this is Hybrid Theory 2.0 at the time. It's so weird looking back on reviews at the time. but very much that it was a continuation of the sound in the same sort of ballpark, which is, I guess, fair enough. And I guess where they were sort of going. The album took them around a year, as in Meteora, took them around a year to record, which opposed to Hybrid Theory, which was just kind of bottlenecked into this really short period of time and thrown out. They had a bit more time to stew on it. It was the, I believe, 8th best selling album of the 21st century, Meteora. Sam, you said earlier it was 7 times platinum in the US. The band have talked about those pressures that they felt coming off the back of it. So that kind of tees us up for where Meteora is at the time. Before we get into that, what was your introduction to Meteora specifically? If that includes Hybrid Theory and a sort of rollover from that, that's fine. But in terms of when you were first listening to Meteora, and I'll come to you first, Elliot, what was that for you? Where did it come from? Was it one track? Was it the whole album? How did you get introduced to Meteora?
So it's an interesting one because with Linkin Park, I grew up when the noughties hit, I was literally 5 in the year 2000, right? And I used to have MTV on a lot when I was younger, when MTV still, frequently played music. And as Sam was saying earlier, a lot of the bands that were culturally relevant at that time, you would turn the MTV on and you would have Linkin Park, Korn, Limp Bizkit, fucking Bowling for Soup, Papa Roach. They were all the bands that were being played. And Linkin Park would quite frequently come on with Numb. I would see Somewhere I Belong. I would see Breaking the Habit. But these songs, again, I was really, really young. I was still a kid. So it wasn't until Minutes to Midnight, the album after, had released, that I really started grasping a concept of who Linkin Park were as a band. So I kind of worked backwards. And I became effectively around that third album, I became like a mega fan of the band and went back through, Hybrid Theory, Meteora. And I remember in particular with Meteora being absolutely obsessed with Breaking the Habit. It was my favorite song. I had that song on repeat all the time. I loved the animated music video for it. The whole style around Meteora, like when you're young and impressionable and you have this, you're trying to sort of fit into some sort of sense of belonging, and Linkin Park had that for me, like what I guess modeled myself on, the kind of music I got into through Linkin Park, through Meteora, through that nu metal sort of rap rock blend that the band were presenting, definitely molded me going forward. Probably more than any other band that I have ever listened to has. And obviously a large part of that was the songs on Meteora. I mean, Faint, arguably. So I used to always like, oh, I don't like rap music. I don't like rap music. And then Linkin Park came into the fray, and suddenly, I was listening to Faint. I was listening to like Nobody's Listening. That's an underrated banger. And then suddenly I realized actually I don't dislike rap. I just am being selective. And obviously, as the years have gone on, that's expanded. But again, it all goes back to Linkin Park and Meteora and especially those rap heavy songs that Mike features very prominently on. So yeah, I think a lot of people would agree with Linkin Park, especially Meteora, then having 2 bodies of work out for people to formulate like kind of like almost like an identity on, definitely would have shaped people going forward into how expansive their music taste could then become.
What time to be alive for you, where you're stumbling in on minutes and then get to track backwards, unknowingly finding out that it just gets better and better. Sam,
Yeah.
How about you? I feel like you'd be in since Hybrid, but maybe I'm wrong.
No. I heard Hybrid at the time that it came out. I was actually, weird story without trying to get of a tangent. Liam Payne from One Direction sat me down and showed me Hybrid Theory.
I remember this.
Yeah, in our primary school classroom. It was
I
like
forgot about
the
that
end of year
story, man.
5, and we could all bring in something from home. And he brought in a Linkin Park CD. And he was like, "Oh, you should check this band out." And he showed me them, and I was like, this is. But I was like 10. I was like, Liam Payne, by the way, Undercover Grebo, just
You heard it here first,
Just come
people.
out and do it. Just come out and do a version of Death, bro. I know you really want to. Um, and at the time, I had just started getting into more classic rock. So for me, I grew up in a more like sort of traditional heavy metal environment with my parents and stuff. This is like AC/DC and Iron Maiden and things like that. And I went down that route first. My first real interaction where I really immersed myself in Linkin Park was actually hearing them at the Live Out gig in 2005. Um, they were flicking between London and Philadelphia, and Linkin Park did a Philadelphia gig, and they did. I think they only did two songs. I think they did in the end. Then they brought Jay-Z out for none. And
Amazing.
I remember hearing that, and I was like, "This is really interesting." Because at the time, I was getting into more classic rock and riffs and stuff. But I was 7 years old in 2000, so obviously I was into Eminem because that's you had to be right. It was like a rite of passage for any white boy under the age of 9, pre 9/11, is you were a big Eminem fan, and that's just it. It's just it. It's just it. You had a flaming shirt and the first Marshall Mathers LP, and that was who you were. And then later you bought Bionicles and tried to find a girlfriend, and that's just how life was for you.
Feels so
But
called out.
it's true, bro. It's
Bang
true,
on.
isn't it? It's
Yeah.
true. It like I reckon there's about 4 million men in this world, in our country right now, that you can just draw a line of delineation from Pokemon cards all the way along, and it's just like just cultural little stopping points, and that's our generation. But anyway,
Bionicles,
so
man. Bionicles were great.
oh, bro, I think I've still got them somewhere. Just
Bionicle to
fantastic.
Linkin Park pipeline.
Oh, absolutely. Bionicle supremacy. But like anyway, so I heard this gig, and honestly, because it was at the time I was quite sad looking back now that I kind of missed the boat when like because I remember hearing like Limp Bizkit on like children's TV shows. This is the thing I'm talking about. Like we used to watch like SMTV Live. I'm hoping there's some nods. In like with Cat Deeley and Anton Deck and stuff. And Limp Bizkit were like a musical guest. And it was like that was Limp Bizkit. Now let's find out what Ashley's doing in the Indigo League. Bro, like what a time to be alive. And I feel like I missed that boat a little bit, getting into Linkin Park a little bit later on. But when I heard Linkin Park, it was the perfect confluence of my burgeoning interest in rap, as Elliot describes, and that simplistic riff work that was actually kind of oddly reminiscent. If you got to see yourself to me, imagine that you would just listen to AC/DC for the first time for like 18 months, and you kind of hear Linkin Park riffs. There's kind of like an odd simplistic similarity between them that you can kind of just make a leap, and that for me was really really interesting. Linkin Park were the first band that I felt that were mine. So I'd got into music through my parents, but it was always like it was almost like wearing your dad's old shirt. Like it was cool, but it was never yours type of thing. It was like an inheritance. But Linkin Park actually found like the first band that was actually cultivated for my own identity, which was really cool. And then I bought the live album, Jack, live in Texas. I actually bought that before buying any of the studio records because it was both albums. So I thought that this would be a good introduction because it would contain both. And then obviously you watch the DVD, and I was welling from there. And I bought the first album I bought with my own money was Meteora about a few months later. And that was it really. So Linkin Park for me were really the epicenter of my own musical journey, which is really cool to see how that if so with the other people experience the same level of nostalgia associated with that band.
I had a similar experience to Elliot in that I'd stumbled across singles here and there from various albums up to and including A Thousand Suns. And it was at that point that I started to go for the albums. What you're talking like 2010 by the time that I'm going through the albums one by one, which is crazy considering the sort of Linkin Park fan that I am now. And that resonates for me, Sam, what you say about missing it at the time. And we were talking about it a little bit the other day. And I just wish I could have been in that. There's certain parts of Linkin Park's history that I've been part of that I feel very lucky. There's Hybrid Theory at Download Festival, and there's Chester's last ever gig, Sam, that you and I were both at.
Yeah.
Both the most poignant live moment, probably in retrospect, ever, and may ever be for me. But those early days, those golden days, seeing that and being part of that, that's something I've stumbled back on and had to just relive through all of those YouTube clips, interviews, and things like that. And it's funny, it somewhat captures that sense. I still feel a sense of nostalgia, even though I wasn't there, which I think it's very telling. My first stumble onto Meteora was probably the first bit of what I would consider at the time to be heavy music for me, that gateway. And it was Lying From You, and it was on a Final Fantasy video on YouTube, because I was really into Final Fantasy VII, and I was just scrolling through different stuff because I just like to see different things where Cloud's just knocking about doing cool shit. And someone had just clipped together something where they put Lying From You on, and I was like, whatever this is, it's amazing. And then just started to track back through, and it's personally, Meteor is my favorite Linkin Park album as well. As an avid fan of, I would suggest all of their albums. I know that there's not people like that. There's different kinds of Linkin Park fans, just like Star Wars fans. I love them all, but Meteora for me is probably just tips it. So
I reckon.
No, go on, Elliot.
I reckon there's a high possibility that Linkin Park probably also have the highest ratio of like anime music videos, like the Final Fantasy one that you found on YouTube.
Yeah. And it somehow that was a gateway. I'm not even like a huge anime fan, but it got me at the time. So let's talk a little bit about. We're at the time of we're all talking about this, and we weren't quite there at the time. But how important is this release for Linkin Park at that time? You've dropped Hybrid Theory. You've toured extensively for 2 years. You sat in the studio. What is that? What does that album mean for them at that time?
I think in terms of the way of their career, the fact that it's weird looking back, because if you read some of the interviews, they had a lot of the songs already ready to go.
Yeah, true.
And it was just a case of sort of structuring them and things like that. A lot of the stuff they'd wrote on the Hybrid Theory tour, and not necessarily a case of finalizing, because it's different to the album. And one of the interesting actual criticisms, or it depends on how you see it, is that this album is very produced, and very clearly, meticulously placed together. I think if you listen to some of the reviews of it, they're not all as weirdly glowing as us. So obviously it's an interesting conversation how much of this is sort of rooted in our own particular fandom, really. I mean, like Q called it a less an artistic endeavor than an exercise in target marketing, is what Q called it. And you can actually listening to it, it was very clear that the Linkin Park were in this 3-year period where they'd written maybe 30 songs in this particular style that coincided with this cultural development. And I think if they had just written the 12 tracks that are on Hybrid Theory and hadn't written the additional 15 that they then structured to Meteora, there's a chance that Meteora sounds incredibly different, because I don't think that band would have made the conscious choice to replicate. I think what happened was they had 25 to 30 songs from that 3-year period. They obviously, the Hybrid Theory ones had already gone, but that 2001, 2003 period, they had an additional chunk of songs from touring, and they perfected those and made those as palatable and well mixed and well constructed as possible. And when you hear what they did 4 years later with Minutes to Midnight, you could make the argument that Meteor is less of a continuation of, or more like, it's more likely that they actually tie the bow on nu metal, really, for them. In terms of importance, they had to prove that they weren't a one-off. They had to prove that they weren't an anomaly. And there were several bands during that period of time that produced massive hit singles that then completely faded. For example, Linkin Park toured with POD in 2003. Do you remember those? Christ almighty. And the bands that they had to cement themselves as a real figure in rock music, because I imagine, as most reviewers at the time, nu metal was actually on the way out by March 2003. Nu metal's peak was in the rear view window, and only an album that was as meticulous and as carefully curated, and really, let's be honest, as radio friendly as Linkin Park's, would have kept nu metal going from the other 6 to 8 months that it did. And then it really gave gave the genre the last kick before really by 2004 it was definitely all over. I think it was massively important to Linkin Park's career because it gave them the additional live support to move forward. And then when Minutes to Midnight come out, they completely abandoned nu metal almost wholly. And for the genre as a whole, it gave the genre as a whole a little bit of life that then extended into the collaboration with Jay-Z. But it's an interesting timestamp. It really, really is. It's almost like pre-war and post-war, like a BC and AD. Because if you just add 6 months to the release, this album's probably completely different and probably much less successful. It's the last great nu metal record over like a 9-year period from Korn's first album right up until this one. And nothing that bands in Linkin Park's world ever even wrote music that even remotely sounded like this at that time. It is really fascinating listening back and what immediately followed it later.
It's funny, isn't it? Because people say that Linkin Park blew up nu metal, but then blew up nu metal and actually killed it. And that's said quite a lot, isn't it?
I think like sort of riffing off a couple of points that Sam said, I think on the one hand, it's from a certain point of view, you could argue that Meteora was the singular most important Linkin Park record in the sense that they had already made such a massive impact with Hybrid Theory that, again, like as you said earlier, Jack, like trying to follow that, they had to like there are so many bands in this world that, all right, you've got your one hit wonders in terms of like there's a band that people know because they've got one big song. There are also bands out there that just relentlessly tour one album anniversary after anniversary because it's all they've got going for them. Now that could have happened to Linkin Park if they weren't so damn good. So Meteora really, it was the proving album. Like, okay, this band has had like this sudden rise to success with their debut. But it's always, they always call it the difficult second album. So they had quite a lot to prove coming out with Meteora, and for it to and then again, riffing off of what Sam said with nu metal effectively dying afterwards, it's because Meteora was the peak of it. What's the point of releasing a nu metal record after Meteora? It's been done at the best it can possibly be done. Like
people are still trying, aren't they? We might come on to that.
Yeah.
So do you think that if Meteora was a flop, like what would that have meant for the band?
I don't think
it's over.
Yeah.
Do you reckon it's done? Or do you reckon that they become like an academy-sized band, like a POD, and they just tour every so often?
Yeah.
That really good single that they have.
When you think of how
Such
different
a weird thing to think about.
Minutes to Midnight was after it. Now imagine if people didn't like the second album and then they shifted into something completely different, because you would still have those fans going like, oh man, it's not as good as Hybrid Theory. But at least with Meteora, like, all right, yes, there was a few people out there at the time sort of saying like, oh, we didn't like it as much as Hybrid Theory, but there was another wave of people. And even to this day, I come across people that actually say they prefer Meteora to Hybrid Theory. Those albums are kind of like not twins, but they're kind of like brothers, I guess. They're siblings.
Group them, yeah.
You can group them into Linkin Park's nu metal era, before they moved on into becoming what I would just classify as an experimental band. But it's if that album hadn't done as well as it had done, if it hadn't been similar enough but with enough like new stuff going on for it, and it did lead into, like we've said, the Jay-Z stuff. It also important to note that you had I don't want to fumble here, Reanimation that came
a
year
just
before
Meteora,
before. Yeah, we didn't get many. Yeah, so Numb, Encore, and the Jay-Z mashups were effectively that kind of experimentation that we had off of the back of that. So they took someone that was culturally huge at the time, Jay-Z, fused it with Linkin Park, who were also culturally huge at the time, and it was an even further merging of Sam talked earlier about he came into Linkin Park sort of off the back of Eminem and rap stuff, whereas I came into it off of rock. That's in Just Us Two. You've got a prime example of the worlds that Linkin Park managed to marry. And I would argue that they did that to a further degree with Meteora than they did with Hybrid Theory. Because it was Mike's rapping in on Faint and Nobody's Listening, and I know I've mentioned those two tracks earlier already, but that really pulled me into accepting rap music alongside rock music.
Yeah, I agree with Elliot entirely. What Meteor did for the band gave them the platform to then work with Jay-Z, which then gave them the platform to be probably a consideration for a blockbuster film with what I've done, which then gave them the platform to essentially do what they wanted for the next 15 years of their career, because they had 3 successive huge selling albums, 2 of which were completely opposing in style and were equally memorable in terms of having this cultural moment. I mean, it's worth remembering that Jay-Z had just brought out the Black Album in 2003, which if you're putting together any list of top 10 21st century rap albums, it's that, then a big gap than most of the others. It really is I don't know what the equivalent is now. I don't know if it's Kendrick Lamar working with Bring Me the Horizon or something like that. I've tried to make this comparison before. Like, what's the cultural equivalent to what that was? Because I don't think there's even a band in 2023, a rock band, that's could have done the kind of crossover. Because even Bring Me don't have the kind of American success that Linkin Park obviously had. And all the big American bands tend not to cross over here. Bands like 21 Century Pilots, all that sort of stuff, they don't have that kind of appeal either. Maybe someone like, I don't know, Fall Out Boy, or maybe even Foo Fighters. But again, they're not contemporary to this period in the way that Linkin Park were. So the point that I'm trying to make is that Meteora extended what with Hybrid Theory was an incredibly unique moment where, because what Linkin Park successfully did was took a nightclub underground style of music and then brought that to a mass audience. And then in 2003 cemented that mass audience, ironically isolating some of the more like grungier metal fans who kind of wanted to keep it to like early Korn records and things like that. And this is what always happens. Bands get too successful for like metal fans to enjoy them or something. And then it cements them in as this other thing. Linkin Park are now or at the time from 2003, Linkin Park were a cultural reference point for people outside of the industry. Meteora and Hybrid Theory is symbiotic in the way that they both did that. They both did that for the band. You can't have one without the other, because as Elliot points out, we are just having 20th anniversary shows for Hybrid Theory. They're playing in an academy. We hear in the end at 3 a.m. in nightclubs. People are like, oh, do you remember that? You know, I don't know, it's nothing against them, but if Linkin Park don't bring out Meteora, there's not a great deal of difference between them and The Darkness, with Permission to Land, in the sense that was a huge selling album within this country.
That's actually the album I thought of when I was saying about bands before.
Right. Yeah, right. And it's a class album.
I thought you were a massive Darkness fan. Cool. So Meteora wasn't a flop. Few. And looking back in retrospect now at how important, I guess, both Hybrid Theory and Meteora were in terms of their impact and influence, it's still clear today. How much of an influence do we feel Meteora has had on music that followed? What were the key moments following it? And is it still influencing now? Are we still saying that is an influential album now? I know
100%.
Of course.
Yeah, I think so. It's just dominoes. That's all. It's just dominoes. So, like,
would you say that those 2 albums were the setup for what you would because Sam, you're really good at drawing on this, those sort of subgenres, and in that big metal list that you put together, the cultural impact and then what it meant. What are we looking at? What did Hybrid Theory set up that Meteora solidified, and what does that mean for music now? Where are we now?
Yeah, first of all, thank you. It's very nice of you to say. But I would say rather than the genre stuff, because it's interesting, the Linkin Park influence for me doesn't stretch actually the musical stuff. It's the notion of what a band can be experimentally and artistically. Now, if you take Linkin Park out, there's about 30 years difference between like Nine Inch Nails and Bring Me the Horizon, and then later bands like Sleep Token, even in terms of bands that are taking different styles and melding them together with real impunity. And what Linkin Park managed to do over the course of their career is accrue a level of trust from the record label, level of autonomy among themselves as musicians to essentially just do what they liked. And that's the benefit of being able to write consecutive hit albums early in your career, is that you have the ability to have that kind of artistic freedom. Bands like Parkway Drive and Bring Me the Horizon have found out that you have to sell a lot of records to be able to get that artistic autonomy later on. Whereas Linkin Park had the almost the gift of being successful early enough to be from their third album. They were like, we just do what we like now. And that relationship between record labels and musicians has been a shifting one. And I would say now that the gap is greater than it's ever been in terms of the decisions that bands are making amongst themselves and the decisions that record labels would like bands to make. That gap is further and further apart. And I think that Linkin Park were one of the real bands that continued that separation through the 21st century. There's a really famous story in the early 90s. Trent Reznor talks about meeting Jimmy Iovine, and Nine Inch Nails had brought out maybe one record. They were trapped in a record deal, and Jimmy Iovine was about to set up Interscope, which became the record label of the 90s. He signed Marilyn Manson and No Doubt, and attached himself to all the rap stuff that was going on. It was just massively successful. And Trent Reznor was joking that Jimmy Iovine sat in a meeting and said, "What do you want?" And Trent Reznor said, "I want to write my own album, choose the artwork, write all the songs myself, choose the singles, give them to you, and you just put it out." Jimmy Iovine went, "Yeah, what else do you want?" He said, "All right, I want to pick my own studio. I don't want my own producer, and I want to tour with who I want and when I want and how long for." Jimmy Iovine said, "What else do you want?" And Trent Reznor said, "I didn't actually have a third thing. I'd run out of stuff by the second thing that he let me have." And it was such a landmark moment at the time for rock artists to be able to then start dictating the process in which they were producing their own music. Linkin Park furthered that, I think, in the 21st century with the level of success. You couple that with the collaborations with Jay-Z and stuff like that. They became their own entity, separate to the success and failures of rock music. That's the thing about Linkin Park that I've always respected massively, is that somewhat like Metallica to a lesser degree, the success and failure of metal is ineffectual to Linkin Park over the 20-year period. Whatever people were interested in 2009, Linkin Park was still going to put records out and sell fairly well. Whatever people were interested in 2013, that was the same thing. Linkin Park actually became almost bulletproof in the same way that if Iron Maiden bring out an album, as good, bad, or indifferent you might feel about it, the same 10 million Iron Maiden fans are going to buy that record and listen to it. They have anchored that fan base. And then you look now, the approach that Linkin Park took to be a studio-centered band, to have all this material that they are in control of. They have this direct relationship with their fans. They have these very fan-orientated experiences that are not at all, not even remotely dictated by the record label, actually entirely separate to the record label, where record producers are ringing up Mike and saying, "We found this, what do you want to do about it?" Rather than someone being like, "Hey, Chester died, should we see what we can root out?" Which is what a lot of record labels did and tried to do with like Prince and Elvis and Michael Jackson, all that type of stuff. The autonomy that exists within Linkin Park's sphere is very unique to that band and has become a open door later on to bands like Bring Me the Horizon that are incredibly experimental. And as I mentioned earlier, I think Sleep Token are the next extension of that. That's that we every couple of years we've taken a couple of steps forward, right? We get bands that choose their own singles, and then bands that choose their own artwork, and bands that choose their own tours, and bands that choose their own contracts, and bands that choose to record their own stuff, then bands that build their own studios. Then we've got bands like Bring Me the Horizon that are just deciding to release EPs without telling anybody. And then we've got bands like Sleep Token who don't even tell people their names. And that's the delineation of musical control. And I think you go all the way back to the late 80s and 90s where bands like Nine Inch Nails and those new metal bands with the smaller labels were doing their own stuff and not being dictated to. bands like Metallica were just doing what they wanted because they were huge, but like small bands were starting then to scratch out their own identities within their record labels and within their fan bases. You look band like even bands like While She Sleeps, right? Build their own studio, completely separate. That doesn't happen in 1999. That doesn't happen in 2009. That might not happen in 2012. Like this is all very recent developments, and bands like Sleep Token existing. We talk about it's like it's the Slipknot, but like with sadder music. Roadrunner knew who Slipknot were. It was us that didn't know. They all signed contracts in their own names. Sleep Token are completely separate to that. So tangent aside, it's actually less about. I don't listen to an album and think that reminds me of Linkin Park, but I read PR notes and I read interviews, and that reminds me of that thought process and the band that they've become. Where, like I said, metal could be and has been at various times. I remember like 2014, 2016, where we were like, metal is fucking dying here, falling on its face. We were getting to the end of that deathcore, metalcore run. There was no big metal bands. And Linkin Park could release an album and it's incredibly successful. It's immaterial. And their ability to control their own destiny like that, I think that's the influence, the cultural shifts that have happened. And it's wider as well. I will say it's not just specific to metal. It's not even specific to pop culture in general. The consumer is becoming proactive in selecting, and the record labels are dying out now. That relationship is completely shifted. But I think Linkin Park, more than many bands in the 21st century, helped accelerate that shift forwardly and explicitly. And you can see the ripple effects of that even now.
Yeah, I think you're right. And just to add to that, that real sense of ethos that they built around the band, I think that's what you see bands really trying to replicate as well. You know, they had it covered, didn't they? And they had the talent, and they had the producer, they had the ability. You know, they had the likes of Joe Hahn making their music videos. They had Mike producing what they could do. They could make studio ready stuff on the road, and they were so ahead of their time in that sense. You know, and I think from what they built on Hybrid Theory, Meteora helped them to solidify that. And one of the really interesting things that I find about Linkin Park as well is that is the way that they really capture and hold their fan base. I feel like they do it like no other band has done. They were doing it back then with LP Underground, and the way that they cultivated that and have been releasing underground albums for years. You know, some of the demos that you hear now will have been heard by Linkin Park fans before in different iterations or whatever it might be. And you see that replication now. I think, you know, Bring Me have kind of latched on to that from sort of Sempiternal onwards, and then realized, oh, we can do that. You know, the way that they do tour diaries, the way that you get a real insight into the band, the way that you kind of feel like you've been there with them at every part of the musical journey. And if you YouTube anything from Linkin Park in the studio, there's something relatively extensive on every one of their album runs that you can go and find, and you can feel like you were there in the studio with them. And you don't always get that because they're just so prolific in nature. And I think Meteora was them doing that, pouring all of that in. But I don't think that happens, Sam. You're absolutely right. If they don't have that success to be able to then dictate. But I do find that, you know, even like you look at some of the stories around what they were trying to be, the labels were trying to make them into on Hybrid Theory, and they kind of had a good idea of themselves early on, didn't they? And I think you're right. I think they probably had a really clear idea of what they wanted Meteora to be and put it out as that. And it was unapologetically what they wanted it to be. And I think if critics were saying this is an extension and what you know, just a more produced version, it's probably exactly what they were going for, from what I kind of gather. In terms of their influence now, absolutely on the PR front, you know, that you just see, I think when bands either get a little bit stuck or they feel like, how do we kind of merge things together here to capture a sense of heaviness, but try and step into the commercial world, generally you find them taking the Linkin Park model. Architects, you know, it's the first comparison, isn't it? You know, when Bring Me stepped into a world where they were kind of treading the radio play line, it almost becomes impossible not to compare it to them. And I think it's because of that radio quality that they kind of garnered, you know.
I think something else that Linkin Park were hugely impactful on, and especially a lot of the songs on Meteora would have played into this. So I'm talking specifically Numb, Somewhere I Belong, From the Inside, Breaking the Habit, right? These are all deeply emotional songs in an era that was just coming out of like new metal kind of. There was still a lot of like quote unquote rock stars in new metal, right? You had larger than life figures like John Davis and Fred Durst and even bands like Mudvayne and stuff doing all of the kind of like I guess like shock rock get ups and things, whereas you had Linkin Park coming at you from this emotional connection angle, really paving the way for bands like, don't get me wrong, music has always been, people bearing their soul at you, but for a long time, especially with rock music and metal music, it was about who had the biggest bollocks. And Linkin Park weren't about that, and they started paving the way for artists to come out and just bare their soul again, even in a heavier genre of music. Even when you've got distorted guitars and raps laying over the top of it, they were able to have that impact. So bands moving forward from that were able to connect with their fans, not only through their songs, but like you said, through tour diaries, through fan groups. They really did connect with their fans in on a level that I don't think any band had ever done before, because there will always be an element of people looking up to musicians, putting them on like these godly pedestals, but Linkin Park was so accessible as people. Like, you knew the intricacies of a lot of their personalities. You knew what it was like to see Chester smile at a fan. You knew what it was like to see Mike's little cheeky little grin, and you would see the back and forths of them cracking jokes with each other, whether that was on stage in a tour video, through something they've put out in the fan club. You had access to demos. There was just so much of it that bands going forward from that are able to be more versatile than ever before. They're able to present those kind of things in the public eye. And I think, like leading slightly on from that, that's why when you hear a track like Lost, which, it's the first new track we've heard Chester on since they put out One More Light. Um, I think with the Hybrid Theory demos, I don't believe we got anything new from the Vault. I might be wrong. Um,
There was a couple, but they'd circulated a little bit before, hadn't they?
they were sort of more
You could find
demos
them.
rather than finished tracks from the Vault. Like, whereas like this song, when you hear it and it hits you hard, because all of everything I just spoke about comes back. If you paid attention to Linkin Park from any point from Hybrid Theory all the way up until One More Light, and you hear that vocal and that emotional outpour on Lost, Chester's massive chorus, the way his voice strains, the lyricism of like of Lost, literally the meaning of the song, knowing that we now don't have him here with us, it hits you like a truck. And it's deep and it's powerful and it reignite. Even if I hadn't listened to Linkin Park in a little while, they'd been. I have this tendency not to listen to bands that aren't like actively touring and that kind of thing. But obviously, I got excited because Lost was coming out. I was like, "Oh my god, it's a new Linkin Park song! Like, never before heard." And I listened to it, and it just reignited my undying love for Linkin Park. It doesn't matter how distant from them I get in my life, there is always going to be like a good 10 years or so that I was this mega fan for that band, where they meant the world to me and they shaped me as a human being. And you hear these new tracks and it comes back. It literally comes back. And we've still got, I think, like 7 more unheard tracks to go, plus a couple of demos on this upcoming song, which is crazy, that we're gonna get more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you talk from a place of what that will mean for so many fans, which talks to the unsurprising success of Lost and then
Yeah.
Fighting Myself, the 2 singles that have been out at the moment, because they take you right back. And there's other deep cuts that are accessible for Chester through like Grey Days, and Sam and I have discussed the Grey Days albums on this podcast before, and they were really special. But because that kind of proves to me, though, that this release on Meteora isn't just carried by the loss of Chester, and also talks to how important that was for people at the time, that capturing emotion and that capturing something that is relatable and that's carried all the way through 20 years on. It's just taking people right back there, isn't it? And I think that's a testament to how important this is, how important they know this is. And I think it would have been that important if Chester was here or not. But now, hearing Chester's voice in a time where he was considered to be in his absolute prime, with these songs that at the time had a real meaning to him and now take on a whole new meaning, is so fucking special, man. Like, you're not going to be able to replace that experience, whether you haven't listened to Linkin Park for a year, 2 years, or since the album came out. I think it's going to be something that really sort of grabs you when it comes out on Friday. Sam, anything to add before I wrap it up, bud?
I think no, I think you summed it up really, really nicely. I think it speaks to the impact that they've continued to have, and I think Elliot's personal eulogy speaks to the relationship they're still maintaining with the fans. I think you touched on something that's really, really important, is that when you listen to these lyrics again from this period of time, it's just incredibly sad when you look back and think he was writing about depression and isolation for like 2 decades. You know what I mean? Like that every song these 2 records that he had the lead writing role in are all really, really misanthropic, really, really tough. And now, as Elliot points out, in the context of what recently happened with his passing away, just incredibly sad. Incredibly sad.
It's horrible to think it's not even that recent anymore. Like, that time has flown,
no.
man.
Even
Yeah,
like
was it 6 years?
Yeah.
7, 8. It's 2016. Anyway, yeah.
But yeah,
Oh,
even
sevens.
like fast forward, I'm 27 right now, right? Fast forward another 20, 25 years. If you was to, maybe we'll get anniversary releases for the other records, but if you were to put on Lost specifically, or any song from Meteora, doesn't matter how far in my life I get, and I think I speak for, again, a huge majority of the Linkin Park fan base when I say this, it will transport you straight back to how you were feeling when you were a Linkin Park fan, when they were still here with us, when they were still touring, when they were wherever you were. If you were lucky enough to be in the time span that that band was active, so that they meant something to you, and it doesn't matter what album you came in on, listening back to these old songs and the new slash from the vault songs, they're going to take you straight back to that place, and they're going to make you reminisce and realize that, yeah, they were singing about, especially if you're a teenager, you have a lot of emotions at that point in your life coming out. You're not really knowing where to turn. Linkin Park were almost kind of like a rock for a lot of people. I cannot tell you the amount of comments I've seen from people: Linkin Park saved my life, your music saved me, all of that kind of thing from Linkin Park fans, myself included. There would have been a point in my life where I would have considered Linkin Park to have almost been like a guiding light for me when I didn't know how to process deeper emotions properly, especially negative ones. They kind of take that, and almost like their music just tells you, like, it's okay, like we everyone feels this at some point, like you can get through this, like it's, and that hold that it has on the fans of the band, I think, will remain for as long as Linkin Park fans still live.
I also love the idea that I would hope, given the commercial success of Lost, that you might have new fans stumble upon that and do what you did, Elliot, on Minutes, and do what I did on A Thousand Suns, and track back through, and how special that's going to be for those people stumbling back on it and then almost joining that level. I think more than anything else, the fact that they can somehow live on is just, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing, isn't it?
And if people can still get into, Nirvana these days, like young kids are growing up still listening to Nirvana and all kinds of bands that aren't there anymore, I don't see why Linkin Park shouldn't be part of that.
Totally agree. Lads, this has been an absolute pleasure to sit down in an evening and discuss this with you. I feel we haven't even talked about how special, incredible the tracks are. We haven't done any kind of review. We've just sort of poured over the album, but that you know, in general and what it meant, and that's kind of, you know, what I'd hoped to do with it. So thank you both for that. If you're still with us at this point, thank you so much for listening. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Noizze UK or Noizze Podcast Network. Please give us a follow, subscribe. Anything goes a very long way. Comment, do whatever. Shout at Sam. He usually gets that, so that's he's okay with it. True, it's happening so much more. But yeah, no, we really appreciate it. And if you have any thoughts on Meteora, comment below, because if you like it as much as us, then chat to us about it. But yeah, we're the Noizze Podcast. Cheers.